Alright everybody, so it's been a while since I've been surrounded by coolers, but we're back onto the cooler reviews with a little bit of an interesting roundup here. Look, within the last year or so, there's been a lot of cooler launches that we simply missed. We did not have the time to cover. In addition to that, there's a couple of classics that are out there that we've never even touched upon. So that is what this video is all about. And look, I'm actually a bit disappointed in myself here for missing some of these before, because there's some absolute gems here that can run with some of the best coolers we've ever tested, like the Phantom Spirit, Peerless Assassin, and yes, even the D15 G2. Anyways, let's start the overall coverage with the new kid on the block, the FSP MP7. A few years ago, they showed off some prototypes of upcoming air coolers, and well, this is the final result. But the MP7 takes a lot more pragmatic approach versus the 140mm based monster we saw back then by using a dual tower 120mm setup that's actually pretty compact. At this point, it's available in silver with ARGB fans or in a matte black finish we have here. But the MP7, it's got a unique trick up its sleeve, 100% memory height compatibility despite having a dual tower setup. That's due to the way its 6 heat pipes sweep gently backwards away from the memory slots. Coolers like the Fuma 3 do this too, but they tend to use a lower performance 15mm thick fan to achieve it. Meanwhile, FSP decided to narrow those fin arrays, so 2 standard 120mm thick fans could be installed. Another thing you won't really see me talk about in a lot of these roundups is the installation kits, unless they're absolutely terrible or they do things that go above and beyond. And well, FSP actually lies in that very, very positive category. I mean, there's some bog standard bits like the plastic backplate that I wish was metal, and standard retention brackets for AMD and Intel, so no offsets here. But where they distinguish themselves is with the color-coded and clearly labeled spacers for each platform. It's little things like this that go a long way to providing a better overall user experience. Next up is the Thermalright Royal Pretor, or Pretor, or whatever you want to call it. And I don't think I've ever had as many requests to review an air cooler, other than the Freezer 36, I guess. Anyways, this is one of Thermalright's newest additions in their quest to dominate the air cooling market with an endless stream of revisions, refreshes, rebrands, and yes, even some brand new products. And despite it being the same height as something like the Phantom Spirit and having 6 6mm heat pipes like the Peerless Assassin 120, it's based on a unique 28mm thick, high airflow, high static pressure fan setup. There's a 120mm at the front to maximize memory compatibility, and the center one uses a 130mm form factor. That gives the Pretor 130 almost the exact same footprint as a PA 120, though it's a bit wider. There's also a change versus Thermalright's less expensive models, with it using soldered instead of pressure-fitted heat pipes, and that should increase heat transfer efficiency, though the actual impact on overall cooling potential is probably going to be pretty minuscule. Anyways, and in terms of Thermalright coolers, that leads to the Pretor 130 becoming pretty expensive. Right now, for the white and black models, we're talking about $50, or it might be a little bit higher by the time you see this video. That is almost double what the PA 120 and PS 120 went for a couple months back, and that is really something to take into account. Probably the most unique cooler here is the Assassin 4 VC Vision, since Deepcool basically threw everything but the kitchen sink at this thing. At a pretty insane $180 here in Canada, it's also the most expensive. So first things first, at a baseline level, there's no difference between this cooler and the Assassin 4 we reviewed more than a year ago, other than 2 big additions: the incorporation of a vapor chamber into the base plate and that integrated display that shows temperature, usage, wattage, and frequency of your processor. Let's start with the vapor chamber, because this isn't really a 3D vapor chamber like some manufacturers like Cooler Master are trying to incorporate into their future coolers. Those integrate the heat pipes into the chamber itself. Meanwhile, this one uses a vapor chamber directly above the CPU contact plate to sort of even out heat distribution before it hits the heat pipes, which are then soldered into place. Deepcool claims this gives them a 3-degree temperature reduction over the standard Assassin 4. Meanwhile, the screen. Well, it's an interesting feature with a few pretty big limitations. First of all, the viewing angles aren't the best, and you'll need to use Deepcool's own software. So yeah, it's another program running in the background, and sometimes it works, though sometimes, of course, it doesn't. And look, personally, I'd much rather see any manufacturer that includes a display like this just integrate seamlessly with a program like HW Info, but unfortunately, in this case, it is what it is. So moving on, the Cooling A620 GDL is probably one of the best looking coolers I've ever come across. I mean, sure, to each their own, but after an endless string of black, silver, and white heatsinks, along with the ones that lean way too heavily on gobs of RGB, it's nice to see something a bit different. So I have to appreciate the subtle gold inlays here, though it might be a bit tough to match other components to it. And you might think this is just another A620 clone, and in a lot of ways, it is. There's still 6mm heat pipes and the same heatsink array as other coolers in the A620 range. But there is one pretty major change. Instead of using a standard 25mm thick fan design, these are brand new 27mm thick models that also have a revised blade pitch and bearing design. These additions should allow the GDL version to run quieter and deliver slightly better decibel normalized performance than its predecessors, while also getting better top-end results. And while I'm sure everybody knows ID cooling by now, or at least you should, Endorfy is the new kid on the block in this roundup, with their Fera 5 and Fortis 5 black editions being the latest coolers added to their lineup. And while they might look like just two basic heat sinks with some RGB thrown into the mix, there's a few unique things going on here. First of all, let's talk about that RGB, with both getting a wraparound ARGB light bar and fan, which are controlled through individual ARGB connectors, though they can also be daisy chained together. But if you aren't into that sort of thing, Endorfy also has all black versions without that RGB. Either way, the main selling point of these Endorfy coolers is not going to be their looks, not in any way, shape, or form. It's the fact that this company is like hell bent on delivering some of the quietest cooling solutions on the market, and their designs go a long way towards achieving that. First of all, their fans have built-in start-stop functions, so the coolers can run in a completely passive mode in low load scenarios. And if you look a little bit closer, those fans have these fins with serrated edges that are supposed to cut down on irritating noise frequencies and provide a perceptibly quieter acoustical profile. I should also mention these are the only single fan coolers in this roundup, though both have the necessary hardware to mount a second fan. Both coolers also use HDT bases rather than a traditional cold plate, which can be beneficial, but there are also some major issues with this approach. Then again, as far as HDT goes, our samples have some of the best finishing I've ever seen. The fin arrays are pretty unique too. The Fera 5 has a very aggressive sawtooth profile, along with a subtle dimple effect that's meant to optimize overall airflow while minimizing turbulence. Again, all to cut down on noise while maximizing surface area. Meanwhile, the Fortis 5 is basically supersizing everything. It uses a single 140mm fan instead of the Fera's 120. The heatsink is substantially deeper, and instead of using just 4 heat pipes, this one uses 6. Its tower also gently sweeps forward, so there's 100% memory compatibility, even with all 4 DIMM slots populated. Now, you might think those additional heat pipes could lead to more efficient heat transfer, but specifically on Intel CPUs, 2 of the heat pipes go pretty much unused altogether. This is why on coolers with more heat pipes at least, HDT can actually hinder performance versus a typical contact plate that distributes heat evenly to all the pipes. And while competition in the air cooler market, or in any market for that matter, is always welcome, I warned you at the beginning of this video that I'm going to be calling out both the amazing and the crappy installation processes. And unfortunately, Endorfy, there's a lot of improvement that they've got to make, specifically with their instructions. First of all, there's no parts list on this thing. This is one critical element that needs to be there so you can make sure that everything that you're expecting is supposed to be there is actually there. Not only that, you need to know what every single piece is supposed to be used for. Like this wrench with the Fortis, it's meant to remove the standoffs, not install them. If you try to use it for installing them, you'll risk over torquing them. Also, there's these rubber dampers hanging around the box. Well, those were simply not pre-installed on the fan for whatever reason. Both coolers also come with these, again, without any information whatsoever. This is what Endorfy calls their Nano Reset ARGB controller, where the RGB of both fans is powered via SATA and the controller is linked to your case's reset button. So really a brilliant solution, because your reset button can then be used to cycle through all of the lighting colors. Anyways, according to Endorfy, they're going to be adding all of this information to their instruction manual and their website. But unfortunately, it's been more than a month since I talked to them about this, and that still hasn't been done. Not only that, but their knowledge base, well, it just goes to a blank page. So look, these are actually, as you're gonna see, pretty good coolers, especially on AM5. All Endorfy needs to do is make a couple little changes to make them great all around. Next up is the Scythe Mugen 6 in its DBE or dual fan black edition setup. And look, the Mugen lineup is no stranger here since we covered the 5th generation version and a bunch of its internal revisions a couple years ago. But the 6th edition here is a completely new design from the ground up. There's a new contact plate, 6 heat pipes instead of the last version's 5, a much denser, more optimized fin array, and a clean looking top plate that finishes everything up real nicely. It also keeps to a pretty compact height of 144 millimeters, despite it being a pretty large overall cooler. Scythe was also able to densify their fin array since they're now using their new high airflow, high static pressure Wonder Tornado fans that top out at 2000 RPM while remaining very quiet. The best thing about it though is the swept heat pipe design, which allows for 2 fans and a thick fin array along with 100% memory height compatibility, where the front fan tucks in nicely behind even the tallest modules. The only problem with the DBE version in particular is that it's very hard to find. If you can, it's priced at around 65 bucks, so it should be pretty competitive. And the final cooler is the legendary Freezer 36, and this one is here by popular request since it's also the oldest cooler by a long shot. It almost needs no introduction. There's a pair of RGB fans, or black ones if you want to save a few bucks, or spend a few dollars more and get the white ARGB version. Those fans have a super easy push to install mechanism too, that's backstopped by a compact tower with just 4 heat pipes terminating in an HDT base. And make no mistake about it, right? This is the quintessential budget heatsink, one that tons of people have used for years as a good all-around option for budget builds or to upgrade stock coolers. And look, Arctic has updated this thing over the years with its new LGA 1700 contact plate and a few other optimizations here and there, but it's starting to show its age. Plus, because of tariffs and some other factors, the Freezer 36 has shot up in price to the point where it's now competing against much more capable coolers from Thermalright and ID Cooling. So that's the lineup that we're going to be testing here, and I'll be straight up with you once again. There's a couple coolers here that are probably going to be out of their depth. Up to this point, we've really only focused on high-end dual tower coolers and a couple higher-end single tower coolers too. So heatsinks like the Freezer 36, Fortis 5, and the Fera 5 might be completely out of their depth. But we also can't forget, those coolers are basically the same price as some competing options like the Peerless Assassin, Phantom Spirit 120, and maybe even ID Cooling's A620 series. And I also have to mention a little change in our normal methodology here, because we ended up doing some internal testing with a bunch of thermal compounds lately, and ID Cooling's new Frost X45 actually won out. Not only did it get pretty good temperatures, but it's ultra easy to apply and clean up, and more importantly for us, its numbers were super stable from one application and mount to the other. So yeah, we requested some and they sort of came through for us. So look, if you guys want to try this thermal compound for yourselves, I'm going to leave a link down below. So let's start with a 7600X, and not one of these coolers beats the Phantom Spirit or Peerless Assassin, and definitely not the D15G2. And that's a big disappointment for the Deepcool Assassin 4 VC and Thermalright's Royal Pretor. But let's be honest here, these coolers are supposedly tuned for higher wattage processors, so they're sort of out of their element here, I guess. Meanwhile, the Fera, Fortis, and the Freezer 36 laser focus on providing the quietest experience around, which is why they all top out at just 39 decibels. But the way they go about delivering those temperatures is very different from one another. Both the Endorfy coolers perform surprisingly well, considering they're the only single fan solutions here, though their numbers are almost identical, despite the Fortis being a much larger cooler. The Freezer 6, meanwhile, well, it obviously struggles on this processor, and that's likely to its older design. Oddly enough though, the Mugen 6, which is supposed to integrate optimizations for AM5, lands a bit flat too. On the other side of that coin, the FSP MP7 does pretty well, especially at slightly higher noise levels, where it's within a degree of the Peerless Assassin, whereas the A620 GDL essentially matches the Phantom Spirit. Narrowing this down to 38 decibels while adding a few other coolers, and we can look at things in a little bit different perspective. Basically, all of these heatsinks keep the 7600X to 82 degrees or less, which means that every one of them is fully capable of cooling the CPU. There are a few standouts though. The A620 GDL is essentially a carbon copy of the SE, while the Endorfys and MP7 are able to keep up with some much higher priced alternatives. The 7600X, well, it's an entirely different beast, and its much higher heat load turns the rankings upside down. Now the Assassin 4 is a lot more competitive, though it still can't catch the D15G2, PS120, or the PA120 for that matter. And so is the Royal Pretor, but only at higher noise levels. Even then, neither is performing as well as we'd hoped. And that's the story with most coolers, since there's a logjam of 5 of them that need higher RPM levels to get their temperatures under the 90-degree mark. The Fortis 5, Fera 5, Freezer 36, MP7, and ID Cooling GDL all fall into that category. Ironically, this also leads to the Mugen 6 becoming one of the best low noise coolers we've ever tested on the CPU. But at 38 decibels, its positioning sinks while the others get better. The ironic thing is that we're seeing some that are technically a lot less capable on paper get better results than so-called premium products like the Dark Rock Elite and Corsair A115. If anything, this shows how important contact placement is, and if a brand prioritizes Intel sockets, well, they're paying for it now with AM5's popularity. And the final step in all-core workload performance is the 7950X, and there's only a few coolers here that can get below the processor's maximum temperature, and then only at much higher decibel levels, with the exception being the D15G2. Among our new coolers, some get simply overwhelmed, like the Fortis, Fera, and Freezer 36, but that was almost like a foregone conclusion. The same thing goes for the larger FSP MP7 and Scythe Mugen 6. On the other hand, we can finally see the Royal Pretor sort of coming into its own. It seems to love ultra hot running processors. Meanwhile, the A620 GDL and the Assassin VC also put down some very good numbers. But let's not kid ourselves here. If you're running a dual CCD processor like 9950X or 7950X in heavy all-core workloads on a regular basis, you need an AIO, not an air cooler. But then again, even the hottest running processors behave very differently in gaming, and so does the positioning in these charts, since the coolers start munching down on all the hot air being produced by the GPU, and that makes things much tougher from the get-go. And that, along with the lack of AM5 contact plate optimizations, really hurts the Freezer 36 and Mugen 6. Meanwhile, the Endorfy, Fera, and Fortis do pretty well considering their single fan, single tower designs. The Assassin VC does the exact opposite of that. Just like the non-VC version, it's just not well optimized for gaming scenarios due to its pull-pull fan configuration. Then there's the Royal Pretor and A620 GDL, which are essentially tied across the entire decibel range, but that still puts them a few degrees off the Peerless Assassin and Phantom Spirit. One pleasant surprise though, that was the FSP MP7 again. It was actually one of the best coolers we've ever tested at lower decibel levels, though its performance sort of stagnated after that. And you can see here that at a normalized 38 decibels, where it's solidly in the middle of the chart. But there's another big takeaway here. If we take the D15 and the Freezer 36 out of the equation completely, there's just about 3 degrees separating 13 different air coolers. So talking about which one is best or not, well, it really comes down to your personal preference. And look, in a lot of ways, those AMD results show one thing, is that a lot of these coolers might have been developed long before Intel completely dropped the ball and AMD started dominating the desktop CPU market. And I know that for one reason, and that is the Intel results. At a relatively low 180 watts of thermal load, so something you'd normally find on a 13600K, 14600K, or 265K, some coolers that were mid-tier on AM5 suddenly become god tier. I mean, look at the FSP MP7. It manages to beat the D15G2 while the Assassin 4 VC ties it. And so does the Scythe Mugen 6, a single tower heatsink. The other coolers really step up too, with the Royal Pretor and A620 finally managing to beat the 2 other Thermalright heatsinks at nearly every single decibel level. Meanwhile, the HDT bases typically suffer on Intel CPUs, and that's exactly what we're seeing here with the Freezer 36 and Fera 5 numbers. And the bigger Fortis 5 that was so competitive on AMD systems, it goes right off the rails here. And if you skip to this point, you might be wondering why that's happening. Remember, 2 of its heat pipes don't even make contact with the processor's IHS, so it is severely handicapped here. But this has always been one of the main handicaps of the Intel platform in general. Optimize well for it, and a cooler can absolutely dominate everything else, even if it doesn't have thermal mass on its side, like the MP7 and Mugen 6, to the point where we're seeing some air coolers within a degree or two of one of the best 240mm AIOs we've tested. Pump more heat into those same coolers with a 253 watt thermal load and everything, it falls apart for the smaller designs. And yet, some of the newcomers put up great numbers here with the MP7, Assassin VC, and Mugen 6 posting spectacular results. That's a huge win for the less expensive Scythe and FSP heatsinks, but a tough sell for the Assassin, considering in many regions it's more expensive than the D15 G2. The A620 GDL and Royal Pretor also post very good results, but they need to get louder than the PA120 and PS120 to ultimately pull ahead. So the Royal Pretor can be an amazing cooler. It just needs to be running at full speed, which is something you probably don't want to do. And that's unfortunate since many people, including me, were hoping this could be, I guess, Thermalright's D15 G2 killer, but it really isn't. It barely manages to beat the lower end Thermalright alternatives. But man, the MP7 and Mugen 6 are really impressive, aren't they? Yet if you crank things upwards again on the Intel platform by uncorking their high-end processors, there isn't a single cooler that can keep up, with one exception. The Assassin is actually able to get below the processor's thermal throttling point, though only at higher noise levels. And if we move on to clock speeds, it's obvious this is the Assassin's home turf. On high wattage processors, its vapor chamber becomes a huge benefit, leading to the absolute best clock speeds we've ever seen from an air cooler. The same thing goes for the Royal Pretor to a certain extent. As TDP increases, its positioning becomes better and better. As for the others, well, the Fortis, Fera, and Freezer simply get overwhelmed, while the Mugen 6, MP7, and A620 GDL all get pretty good results compared to the other coolers here. But look, under no circumstance should you be using an air cooler for situations like this, sort of like what we said with the dual CCD models on the AMD side. Forget it. You'd need a 360mm AIO to get optimal all-core frequencies from an unlocked Intel chip. It doesn't matter if it's Arrow Lake or one of the older Raptor Lake generations. That is just the reality here. On the other end of the spectrum, a gaming load allows CPU coolers that might not have done well in all-core workloads to become a bit more competitive. For example, the Fera, Fortis, and Freezer 36 are all within 1 to 3 degrees of the peerless Assassin. Unfortunately, the Assassin VC starts falling behind yet again in gaming due to its fan setup, while the A620 GDL, MP7, and Royal Pretor are all clustered around that same 3-degree range throughout the entire fan speed ranges. But the real surprise here has to be the Mugen 6. It's able to keep up pretty well with the D15 G2, a heatsink that's much larger and costs nearly twice as much. And you really have to hand it to Scythe and FSP. They found a sort of secret sauce for Intel processors that allows smaller, less expensive coolers to go toe-to-toe with much larger models. Not only that, but they can also beat a 240mm AIO like the Liquid Freezer 3. So with all that being said and done, there is one final small stop that I want to make in this whole whirlwind tour of all of these coolers. And that is talking about the Fortis 5 and Fera 5. We sort of stacked the deck against them, right? And I alluded to that a couple of times throughout this review. These are the only single fan coolers in this whole roundup, but they come with the hardware for a second fan. So what we did is we went out and we bought identical fans to their single fans, and we mounted them up, and the results were pretty interesting. So let's narrowly focus here on the gaming results, because I'm sure that's what most people are going to be doing with their processors. And on the AM5 side, when using a normalized 38 decibels, it was sort of hit and miss. While we saw the Fera 5's temperatures did drop by a little bit with that second fan, it was by less than a degree. So it's obvious its single fan pretty much maximized the cooling capacity from its single, pretty narrow fin array. The Fortis 5 had a lot more to gain, with a drop of almost 2 degrees, putting its numbers among the very best in our gaming test. The only problem with this approach is adding another Endorfy fan or 2 completely different fans does add a lot more to the overall cost. Well, that was interesting, wasn't it? I mean, after all this testing, when the dust settled, it turns out that some of the coolers that we had missed over the last year ended up being some of the best that we've ever tested. On the other hand, there were a couple of highly anticipated launches that ended up falling completely flat, like Thermalright's Royal Pretor. It did pretty well at higher noise and thermal levels, but there's way better options out there for less money. I have a funny feeling this is exactly why we haven't seen the Ultra version yet. They're just struggling to differentiate it from everything else they've launched. The Deepcool Assassin 4 VC was another one. This thing excels in ultra high heat loads, though only on the Intel side. And let's be honest here, there's not many people buying Intel CPUs these days. Plus, if you love its digital display, even that's available on much less expensive Deepcool heatsinks. Even the Mugen 6 DBE was affected by this whole trend. Its numbers on Intel CPUs were incredible, but it took a knee to the face on AM5. On the flip side of that coin, the Fera 5 and Fortis 5 did exactly the opposite. Amazing AM5 numbers, which is good to see considering how popular those CPUs are, but both just fell apart on the Intel side. There's also a few coolers here like the FSP MP7 and ID Cooling A620 GDL that provide excellent all-around performance regardless of the socket. And in all reality, that's the direction that I recommend a lot of people go. And the last cooler I wanted to touch on here is the Freezer 36. And look, I know I'm gonna get a little bit of hate for saying this because the Freezer 36 was the gold standard when it came to budget CPU coolers. And Arctic has done everything humanly possible to make sure that this has been updated enough for modern sockets and modern heat loads. Unfortunately, it's not enough. I think that this cooler has reached pretty much the end of its life right now in terms of price to performance versus modern solutions. So anyways, I'm excited to see what Arctic comes out in terms of updates to this in the future. Anyways, I'm Mike with Hardware Canucks. I hope that you enjoyed this, what is probably a very long video. Rip to my editor, Robert. He's gonna be looking at the timeline for this thing saying, Mike, what have you done? But anyways, I hope that you enjoyed this one and I'm gonna see you in the next video. Have a great day, guys.